Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Leader-Tree, where leadership grows, where strong roots build strong skills, and where tonight we're going to be talking about Martin Luther King Jr. Day. That was yesterday, and here at The Leader-Tree, we like to celebrate leaders, and Martin Luther King Jr. was, in fact, a very consummate leader in a time where it was not cool to stand up against the government. He stood up against the government. He started a movement that would ultimately end in the accomplishment of his goals. Now, he didn't start that movement. I should correct that. But he made a very big part of it, right? He played a big role in getting that movement from moving to finish. And so that's why he's celebrated. And as a leader, we need to celebrate people like him. As a leader, we need to recognize what he accomplished. And so today we talk about Martin Luther King Jr. and some of the things that he accomplished in a very short lifespan, by the way. Very short lifespan indeed. He was only 39 years old. 39 years old when he was shot and killed. That's sad. In Tennessee, by the way. He was shot and killed in Tennessee. That's sad. But also amazing what he accomplished in the 39 years of his life. And the man, he was a big name because of the way that he went about it. Leadership is about style as much as anything else, right? Making a choice, getting people to follow that choice, having a style, which he definitely had. I have had the privilege of listening to some of his speeches, and even seeing him on television. He was very charismatic, which as a leader, it helps to be charismatic because you can draw in a crowd, you can draw in a following, and he had a knack to draw in that crowd. And that propelled him forward. He started off small and he grew. But then he also stuck to his plans. It's funny. I was watching a show last night, an old movie from 1991 called Defending Your Life. And in this movie, you've got, what's his name? Al Brooks. Al Brooks is the main character there, and the leading lady would be Meryl Streep. And in this one section of the movie, they're replaying a scene from Albert Brooks's life, where he's asking his wife to help him prepare for a promotion, or not a promotion, but for a new job interview that he's trying to go after. And he goes on and on. I'm not going to take a penny less than 65. And everything she says, he's like, listen to me very carefully. I need you to understand this. I cannot take this job for less than $65,000. And everything she comes back with, he's like, I'm trying to tell you, $65,000. I cannot do it for less than $65,000. And so she says, okay, well, you're great. You're ready. Then the next scene transitions to the next day when he's actually at the interview. And the job interviewer looks at him and says, we're prepared to offer you $47,000. And he says, I'll take it. No conviction there at all. What makes a leader great is the conviction behind what they're trying to accomplish. And that's something that Martin Luther King Jr. definitely had. He had that conviction behind the things that he set himself to do. He went to jail for it. He stood up for it. He stood in between lines of police and lines of rioters and said, we will not go home. He drew lines in the sand that said, we will not just back down. But there was a style to it that was unique here. And that style was unique because Martin Luther King was a student of peace. He followed the example that Mahatma Gandhi had set over in India when they were fighting against the British for their own independence, right? Whereas he led a group in a different way and said, you know what, we don't want to incite more violence. We want to be nonviolent, right? Because if we incite more violence, what's going to happen? The British Army is just going to crush us like grapes, right? So, plus, he also knew that what he was doing was basically fighting his own people, that the British would arm, right? And they would pay the local Indians to fight the wars for them, right? Conscription. So Gandhi said, we're fighting our own people. Let us not incite more violence, right? A very famous quote of his that Martin Luther King Jr. was fond of was the term, an eye for an eye only ends up making the whole world blind, right? Because if everybody's out there trying to kill each other, nobody can see the way. So Mahatma Gandhi, who was himself assassinated in 1948, was also able to lead his group toward the right outcome. And so Martin Luther King Jr., seeing this, adopted that strategy and then went through with the conviction behind it to live up to that strategy. And that's where it really all comes down to it. That personal style and that charismatic way about him drew people to his movement, drew his movement into the main stage, right? And there were others, for example, another prominent figure at the same time fighting for the same cause was Malcolm X. But now Malcolm X's viewpoints were much different, right? And his style was much different. And his goals were much different than Martin Luther King Jr. Two very good leaders, right? Two convicted leaders that held strong to their beliefs and said, this is what we want to be. But whereas Martin Luther King was talking to people about inclusion and acceptance and being part of everything and being nonviolent and peaceful and creating an atmosphere of love, Malcolm X, on the other side, wanted complete and total separation. I want the whites to be over here in the whites, and I want the darks to be over here on the darks, and let's not wash them together because we don't want to mix, right? That's basically the stand on it. And many people think that because they were at odds philosophically, that Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X didn't get along, but that's actually not true. I've read several books on them both, and they spoke quite often, actually. So, on the phone, they spoke repeatedly on the phone. And what's interesting is that they were both trying to convince each other of their own viewpoints. And neither one of them, of course, would give in, but they respected each other. They respected each other's viewpoints and what they were trying to accomplish. And in the end, they both knew that they were working toward a common goal. And to my knowledge, they only ever actually met in person one time. there may have been more that weren't recorded, but to my knowledge, it was only one time, and they were very cordial and very accepting of each other then. Shook hands and embraced and said, hey, this is my brother, and that's really cool, and that solidarity and that acceptance and that conviction, but also the respect that comes to it, saying, I respect your position. I don't necessarily agree it's the right one, but I get what you're trying to do, and I respect you trying to do it. That's what makes a good leader. That's what makes a good leader. And so Martin Luther King ultimately paid for it with his life. Gandhi ultimately paid for it with his life. And guess what? Malcolm X ultimately paid for it with his life. Common themes, right? There are people out there that are willing to stand up. And in the face of danger, they still stand strong and they say, put me in jail if you want to. Threaten my lives if you want to. Threaten the lives of my family if you want to. It doesn't mean what I'm doing is not right or needing to be done. And if I don't do it, who will? That's leadership, folks. That's leadership. So when you look at your own life, ask yourself, have I ever been in a situation where I saw something that needed to happen and I backed down? Or did I stand up and say, you know what, this isn't right, let's fix it? And if you've done the other one, then ask yourself, if you did stand up, what was the outcome? Chances are, if you're listening to this, you didn't pay for it with your life, at least not yet. But did anybody threaten you? That's the question. Did anybody threaten you? Anybody insult you? Anybody try to tear you down because you stood up for your beliefs? Whether you like, for example, what's going on in the current political spectrum today here in the United States, you got to understand that these things happen over and over again, right? I think people forget and they look at things in a singular perspective, like everything is unrelated to each other, right? But as a country, we're constantly in flux in our struggle to grow, to get better, to get bigger, to get stronger, to protect each other, and to flex our muscles on the world stage, right? As we do that, we go through trials, and we go through tribulations that we've got to work through, right? In the 1800s, there was the Industrial Revolution, which had its own sets of problems. Sure, there was a lot of, innovation, but there was also a lot of suffering that went along with that innovation, right? A lot of people suffered greatly, while others made mega riches off of things, right? But the world progressed. The world moved on, right? And that led us to the automobile. The automobile and also the vacuum cleaner. And that made everybody's life a little easier, right? Being able to drive around made it to where we could move into cities instead of being out in the farms, right? So we could do more with the same resources than we could do before, because we had the Industrial Revolution that helped us do that. There was suffering along those times, right? And that led to the 1920s, right? The early 1900s, because of the Industrial Revolution bringing us all those innovations, we made so much money in this country. Everybody made a ton of money. But then, at the end of the 1920s, there was a big market crash, right? And the whole country was poor. And we looked to the government at the time to help us out. Well, the government didn't do a very good job. Herbert Hoover was in charge at the time of the Great Depression, for example, when it started. And he basically just turned everything off. He just shut down. He couldn't deal with the economic issues facing the country, so he chose not to. He just locked himself away into the White House and continued to have party after party as if it wasn't happening, while people were camping out on the White House lawn begging for help. When that didn't work, he literally called the army out to have them removed, and even had General MacArthur shoot unarmed citizens who were veterans, nonetheless, and their families on the White House lawn until they fled. Now that's not leadership. But then, in the 1930s, we had the World War, Second World War. First one was in the early teens. And we had to deal with that. And yet still there was more suffering. But everybody rallied behind the president at that time, because the president, who was very good at communicating with the people, put together these fireside chats, right? Theodore Roosevelt, he put together, or not Theodore Roosevelt, that's Franklin Roosevelt, put together these fireside chats where you get on the radio every evening and talk about what was going on to the people, right? That's leadership. So when people need it the most, they can band together, right? And here we then moved into the 1960s, and guess what? We got another conflict, and people don't like the president then, right? Because the president doesn't seem to agree with their viewpoints, right? And this is John F. Kennedy. And here's a guy that they elected over another guy that they didn't like, who was Richard Nixon. So they elected Kennedy, and then just 2 years into his presidency, they killed him. Because they didn't like what he was doing. He got threats. He got told. He stood up and stood his ground, too. He had conviction behind it. He said, this is the way it's going to be. Who knows why they killed him? I have my theories. You probably have yours. But one of the things I can tell you for sure is they didn't like the job he was doing because he wasn't playing by the rules. So they killed him for it. One of the things that he did that they didn't like was he sat down on more than one occasion in the White House with Martin Luther King Jr. to discuss ways that the federal government could help make these things come true. They didn't like what Martin Luther King stood for as a country. But they understood that the country needed change. And when I say they, I mean John F. Kennedy and his brother Bobby. They understood that our country wasn't right. It needed change. He also saw the same thing in the nuclear program. And he set out to start dialing us back on the nuclear weapons instead of pushing us forward, which went against everything that the big powers in government didn't want. Honestly, I believe that they shot him over the nuclear thing. But he had just pissed off so many people, in different ways. One, for supporting the civil rights movement. It went against government policy, right? And two, for supporting ceasing hostilities against Khrushchev and Russia, and dialing that back and trying to make peace and end that Cold War that had started since the end of the Second World War. But he had conviction enough to stand his ground. And there was an interview that he gave. I don't remember the reporter's name, but they were sitting there on Air Force One. And the reporter asked him, was he worried about the threats against him? And he looked into the camera. I wish I could tell you more about when that was or who the reporter was. But I'm sure you can find it if you look for it. He looks into the camera and he says, if they really want to get you, they're going to get you. There's nothing you can do about it. You just got to do what you can do while you're here. That's brilliant, because it's 100% honest. Under constant threat, John Fitzgerald Kennedy looked in the eye of the world and said, bring it on. I'm going to do what I can do. And they killed him for it. That's exactly what happened to Martin Luther King Jr. He looked him in the face and said, we can all be together. We should all be together. And I'm not different from you, and you're not different from me. We're both just people. And we should get along together. That went against popular belief at the time, so they killed him for it. Malcolm X, he said the opposite. He said, you're very different from me, and I'm very different from you. We're both stuck on this rock right here. We don't have to do it together. Let's do it on our own. When you see me coming, walk to the other side of the street, and I'll do the same for you. We didn't like that separationist talk within his own group, so they killed him for it. His own people killed him. Most of the country said if you were going to do it anyway at all, that was the way to do it. And didn't like Martin Luther King's version. But it's very interesting because you have all these different styles of leadership. All these different versions of what they all thought should happen. Every one of them respecting the other and being guided by a single purpose, which was to make things better. We have things like that going on today as well. in the current scope. Because, I mean, then after that, you had the Vietnam War that went on. You had the Iraq wars that went on. Now, people are trying to pull us into another civil war over this election. Because they're not big fans of the way our president, Donald Trump, is doing things now. Okay? Will we allow that to happen? Will we allow them to pull us into a civil war over their own ideologies? That remains to be seen. I know for one, I would stand up against that. And I would probably fight on the side of Martin Luther King and Gandhi, rather than raise a weapon against my brother. Because we're all Americans. Whether you're a Democrat or you're a Republican, it doesn't matter. Whether you are a supporter of Donald Trump or you're not, it doesn't matter. In the end, your friends are. Your neighbors are the opposite of whatever you are. Are you going to hate them too? You know, after Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election, my mother had several of her friends, several of her longtime friends, I'm talking like friends, like 20-year plus friends, right? Refused to speak to her again because she didn't back Hillary Clinton. Okay? So because you voted for the other guy, you're no longer my friend? What the hell is that? That doesn't make any sense. But that's the way it was. And now here we are in this election, which is a very interesting election too. It's still going even though it's over. And people are drawing lines in the sand again. Anybody that voted for Donald Trump or anybody that supports Donald Trump, you better watch out. Because people are out to get you. They'll come up and hit you with a rock in the street as you're walking across the road. But then again, people that supported Joe Biden they have to watch out too. Because those that supported Donald Trump will cause trouble too. We're in it together. But for some reason, we keep thinking we're separate. We all fall under the Gandhis and the Martin Luther King's versions of what reality is, but we believe in ourselves as Malcolm X's version. Why is that? And you got to ask yourself, as a leader in today's world, where do you want to be? Unity or separation? It's a good question to ask, isn't it? Personally, I believe unity is the right way to go. As President Abraham Lincoln said, a house divided cannot stand, and he would choose the union above all. And that's what he did. Union, meaning together. For the Leader-Tree, I'm Chris Miller, reminding you to always keep smiling. And if you haven't done so yet, join us at theleadertree.com. Bye. Bye-bye.